Value Impulses with Dr. Ulrich Vogel. Personnel Diagnostics Insights, Leadership Assessments, and Personnel Development.
A warm welcome, dear listeners, to our episode today. We're here at Value Impulses, and today we're talking about something really exciting, namely training, a course in personnel diagnostics. And I have my dear colleague Hanna with me, who has been with us for 2 years now, working very competently, helping us in so many areas, but especially in the psychology firm and in personnel diagnostics, and she also developed this course. We'll get into that a bit more in just a moment. Dear Hanna, a warm welcome. It's great to have you with us today.
Hi, Uli. I'm really glad to be here too.
Very good. So, what's the topic today? It's about our course. Personnel Diagnostics Compact, Making Effective Decisions and Developing. And the whole thing was created as part of our academy. I mean, those who know us better know that we do training. In personnel diagnostics, we certify in profiling values, but it's also an academy in a hybrid format, where we do a lot live, but also quite a lot online. It's built on modern learning journeys with videos and similar resources. So today, as part of the academy, we thought we'd take a look at this course. Personnel Diagnostics Compact, which Hanna developed. What's the need for a course like this? So what's basically the purpose? We have a lot of people in HR and also managers, not just HR, but team leads and so on, who have to make personnel decisions. Who do I bring in? Who do I move? Who do I offer which training to? And so on. But they're not trained for that. And that's where we want to provide knowledge, so people have more tools at their disposal. And how do we want to deliver this knowledge? Or what is our goal with this? Of course, we want to cover a bit of theory. What exactly is it? Personnel diagnostics, because a lot of people think it's just somehow online assessments or just psychometric tests. No, personnel diagnostics also includes very practical things, like structured interviews, for example. We'll get to that later. So, we want to connect theory and practice in order to help close the many gaps that, in our opinion, exist in everyday personnel management, in HR, or at least help people advance and become more competent. And that's why we're getting right into it, Hanna. One of our ongoing hot topics is always the issue of hiring mistakes. And with that, I'll pass the ball over to you. Over to you. Hiring mistakes, there's a lot to say about that, I think, but why don't you get us started? I think that's a really important point when it comes to personnel diagnostics, especially regarding hiring mistakes.
Yes, so the topic of hiring mistakes is actually the main reason why. Yeah, that's also why we came up with the idea for this course. Or I also think that's why research in psychological personnel diagnostics is still ongoing in academia. And why there's an effort to communicate this to the outside world, because it's simply a fact that you waste a lot of money when you hire the wrong people. And above all, it really does happen quite often. There are a lot of surveys where companies have been asked about this. And in those, it was always clear that it really happens often, even if you might not be fully aware of it. And for example, I recently read a study by Gallup stating that the costs of replacing employees who were either hired incorrectly or who quit range from half to double the employee's annual salary. And you really have to let that sink in. Of course, then, it's pretty wild when you see that number, but even so, you might not really feel connected to it or get a sense of it, because it's maybe just some random number and not your own mishiring costs. Basically. And that's exactly why we developed the mishiring cost calculator, where anyone can figure out individually how much it would cost them personally for their own company. A mishire like that. And then, once you really get a feel for it, you might also become more aware that, okay, it's actually worth investing in personnel diagnostics, because overall it's so much cheaper than just dealing with mishires in your head.
having to basically clean up the mess afterwards, so, as you said, it's highly strategic. At that point, but it also has to somehow make its way into day-to-day operations. That was really well put, the way you just said it. Yeah, those are just numbers, but somehow it doesn't feel like it's mine. And then I'm back in my own personnel decision, and somehow I end up doing it anyway. Intuitively. Just going with my gut or based on the impressions from the interview. You mentioned the mis-hiring cost calculator, and I think we should do that too. Probably best if we just put the page we have on our site into the show notes. And you brought up the Gallup study. Maybe we have a source for that as well. So, we want to raise awareness, which I think you explained really well just now, Hanna. But above all, we also want to offer solutions. And the fact is, as you said, science is dealing with this, but in companies, the managers, they're not trained for this kind of thing. And I've been in the market for 25 years now, and I think I've seen over 300 companies from the inside and have accompanied hundreds of job placements. And it's really quite remarkable that not enough has actually changed yet. There is a trend, that's true, it's on the rise, but in a lot of companies, decisions are still just made based on gut feeling. And I think that's still a bit of a mission for us. That we take a closer and closer look at this, and there's the so-called, you put it nicely. You wrote down the scientist-practitioner gap. Maybe you'd like to say a couple of sentences about that, because I think it's a great buzzword.
Yes, exactly, yes. That's a term that's very common in psychological personnel diagnostics and has actually been around for quite a while. So this isn't a new phenomenon, and that's exactly what I wanted to say. So I'm coming now from university. I come from the theory side, and you're really from the practical side. That's why you can judge quite well how it actually is, because, of course, people always say, as it always goes, the researchers, they're always saying things like, yes, you should implement this, and it's so simple. And of course, it's not as simple as people say. But yeah, from a theoretical perspective, it is simple. This idea that there's such little practical application, that you have this methodology, this science, and yet you still don't apply it. And that's exactly the gap between science and practice, which, especially in psychology, there's a real effort to close. And there are highly accepted methods, there are valid procedures that are really clearly proven, they give you meaningful results, and yet they're still not used for various reasons like cost. Or people don't feel like the investment is worth it. Or people trust. This is actually a very common psychological phenomenon, that people always stick to the old way they've been doing things, even if it's not a good way. And I think that's really, really powerful. You can see in this area that people would rather stick to the old, bad way instead of looking for a new, better one.
Yes, that's very well put. So, we stick with the saying that people are creatures of habit, and that this is obviously a real obstacle, even when the knowledge has long been gained and proven. And yet people still go back to it. And say, yeah, I'm being subjective here and that's the right way. And in the end, you don't really know. Or you just accept it. You don't realize what mistakes you're making and stick with these outdated interview processes and outdated questions. We all know them. Yeah. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Where? What are your strengths and weaknesses, and so on? What is this? This ancient stuff and all that, and I'll toss the ball back to you again. Since we're already talking about these hiring processes, taking a look at interviews. I've known about this for quite some time now, and has anything actually changed? But what does the younger generation, which you're representing here in our conversation, actually expect from a good interview? How should it be structured? Really?
Yeah, well, an interview obviously requires preparation and structure. Of course, there are different levels of structure that an interview can have. So we can do semi-structured interviews, or we can do fully structured ones. That's something that might be set up according to preference. But the fact is, it has to be prepared. There has to be some kind of guideline. I should have thought beforehand about which questions I'm going to ask, and above all, I should ask critical questions. So this method is also called the critical incident method. I love this method, and I actually experienced it myself for the first time in a job interview. I experienced it in such a way that I was asked a question like that, and I immediately realized, wow, I can't just pretend or give a socially desirable answer. And you just can't do that, because it's simply a spontaneous answer that comes out of me right now. So, just to explain, this is a method where you basically describe a case, a situation, and then the applicant has to respond with what they would do in that situation. And it can either be related to the past, like, yeah, what did you do in that situation? And how did you handle it? How did you resolve the situation? Or it can also be future-oriented.
Or just hypothetical.
Exactly, that's the hypothetical. What would you do? And how would you handle it? And of course, as the interviewer, you have a clear expectation of what the person should answer. You have points, and then you can easily check off what was answered and what wasn't. And then you have it in black and white. You can see how well this question was answered and how much experience this person might already have in this area. And the person just can't fake it as easily as when you ask, yeah, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? And these strengths and weaknesses also become clear in this question. So it's just a really good method to eliminate things like social desirability.
So you don't just have people introduce themselves anymore, but you really dive into a case, and then you get the reaction. And then, so to speak, it's indirectly expressive, if I may put it that way, of how people are, where their strengths lie, and where you might also quickly notice something. In the answers, you can tell, for example, if someone is unsure or if the area hasn't been well covered. And in that sense, we're also much more concrete, aren't we? And I think that's a really, really great point that we're diving in there. That's already personnel diagnostics, and people always think personnel diagnostics is something really complicated and procedural. No, it's actually about something quite simple. Simple. You just put it really, really nicely. I'll give another example, requirements analyses. Where people say, yeah, requirements analysis, what's that? But it's super important to first get clear on what is actually needed. What expectations do we have for this position? What are the goals? What's the contribution to the company? What results do we have, and so on. And that's the point where I want to dive in with you now. You built the course. You connected the theory and the practice. And that's why we're going to take a look at the course now. So, Personnel Diagnostics Compact, Deciding and Developing Effectively. What do people learn there, Hanna? If I just play the role of a totally uninitiated listener and say, okay, yeah, what can I expect there?
Yeah, so our goal, or my goal when I developed the course, was that, yes, people should learn the basics. So we have our very specific, in-depth certification, and then we thought, yeah, maybe we should add a step before that and just learn the basics, the ones that anyone who makes personnel decisions should simply master, or at least know about. And honestly, a lot of people just don't do that. For example, my mom has also been a manager for a few years now. Before that, she had no idea about any of this. So it's just that you slip into a new role. And she was never really prepared for these HR decisions she now has to make. And there are a lot of them. She often has to hire people or be involved in those decisions. She wasn't trained for that, and once she asked me, so, Hanna, what do you actually do at work? And then I told her, yeah, exactly what you don't do. I come from a theoretical background, and you could be doing that. And yeah, so she always tells me about things like what criteria she uses to make decisions. And I'm like, Mum, that's just not up to date anymore, when she tells me how she looks at grades or qualifications. But exactly.
Can I just jump in here for a second? Hanna, because you put it so nicely. She slipped into this role, and I'd even take it a step further. A lot of people, like your mum for example, basically get thrown into the deep end, and they don't get any support. And often, there isn't even any awareness of this on the management side. And that's why I think what we're doing here is so important. Passing the ball right back to you. I interrupted you. What are some specific things where you can say, in very concrete terms, yes, okay, that's something people learn with us? These are typical things where you'd say, yeah, people need to know that. For example, judgment errors is one thing that comes to mind.
Exactly, so that was the first thing, that you first become aware of what you're actually doing, or what mistakes you could make because you just don't know. So these are all things that come up in everyday life where you just think and think. And you don't even realize how you're thinking. And these are things like the halo effect, which is really typical. For example, when you assume someone has other positive qualities just because they have one positive trait.
Halo means, it translates to halo or nimbus. So basically, one thing outshines everything else.
Exactly. So, for example, if I'm impressed by someone, say because they're attractive or something like that, right, and then I immediately assume, okay, she's also competent and smart and intelligent, and who knows what else, right? So that's one example. Another really important thing is stereotype threat, that you're influenced by stereotypes, by expectations, and also by social influence during the interview. So the interviewer has an influence on how I behave now. And if I, as the interviewer, sit there with a mean look and give off a strict vibe, then that's going to influence the person across from me, how they answer and how they behave. Subjectivity is, of course, also a huge issue. I still can't understand when decisions in the LGA are made by just one person. So it really needs to be a team decision, at least two people, or ideally. Transparency, making sure things are documented so they can be evaluated objectively. This also applies to the interview. The interviews should be able to be evaluated. There should be a structure to the interview so that, at the end, you can say, okay, these points were met, these points weren't. And then you can evaluate it objectively. And gut feeling doesn't play such a big role anymore. Of course, you still have to take gut feeling into account somehow. That's not it. It's misunderstood. Stop trusting your gut.
I think it's a combination. And I think the real art, at least that's how I see it after 25 years, having done a lot of interviews, thousands in fact, is to combine exactly that structure, which is so important, just like you said, with a certain ease or flexibility, so that people don't get the feeling. In the interview, it's not about just ticking off every single point one by one, but rather, it's best to have an interesting business conversation. But you still make sure to cover the areas that the structure calls for. And if I notice at the end that there are still 2 or 3 points missing from the blueprint, then I'll address those as well. Otherwise, in my experience, it's important to help candidates open up by making them feel that what's happening is organic. But for that, you need the knowledge behind it in order to have the blueprint in the first place.
Yeah. Exactly, so the thing about judgment errors was the first step in the course, just to become aware of them. Then, of course, it's also really important that in the course, you learn how to plan a suitability assessment process. So going through the steps, knowing how to start right from the beginning when the applications come in, and then all the way to the end, how to make the decision. Another thing that's really important is just having an idea of all the valid tests that are out there, and also knowing about the ones that aren't valid. So in the course, we also compare a method that isn't very well recognized in the scientific community, but unfortunately is used very often in practice, the MBTI, with a highly accepted and valid method. And it also becomes very clear why the less effective method is used more often, It just isn't that meaningful. So it's good to have an overview there and to know about tests you could theoretically use. And what's also really important, as we mentioned earlier, is creating interviews exactly, designing them, developing interview guides, evaluating them, and also very important, conducting job analyses. So if you don't do that, it's just disastrous. because you really need to clearly define the requirements for a given position, then create a requirements profile from that. So that's the second step in the job analysis. And from this requirements profile, you can easily compare what the person meets and what they don't. What's really important and what isn't. One missed criterion doesn't bar employment. So in the profile, you'd indicate how important a criterion is and whether it's a should-have or a must-have criterion. That's exactly what's covered as well in the course. Yeah.
Because, if you don't do that, an analogy just popped into my head. Then it's like I'm just going shopping because I kind of enjoy shopping. And just seeing what's out there, but if it's really about targeted shopping, if it's about what do I actually need, then I really have to think about it. I have to consider what kind of product is actually necessary to get this or the benefit. And I mean, shopping might be nice for coming up with lots of ideas and so on, but when it comes to hiring people in a company, the first question has to be, what is this potential person's contribution to the company as a whole? And then, what are the specific results that need to be achieved, and what prerequisites are needed for that, so to speak? Whether that's in terms of education, experience, or especially personality traits. And in my experience, I don't know how you see it so far, people are actually happy when they do that. If they haven't learned this beforehand, they just sort of drift around in interviews. And then it's like, I'm just having a nice little cup of tea or coffee together, and we're just chatting about this and that. But if you've prepared well for it, then it's also clear, oh, I have this much time, and that's exactly what I want to use it for. And then I also know what I want. And then I'm just more confident and simply better in the interview.
Yeah, exactly. And above all, creating a requirements profile really isn't time-consuming. Of course, you do have to invest a bit of time. It's not something you just type into ChatGPT, for example, and then it just spits it out. But some really good methods are, things like drawing on your experience. So, how have previous employees in this position performed? Which criteria do you consider important? So, you can ask around, consult experts, do some research, or even just talk to managers or whoever else. Basically, take a closer look at people in the company who are already in those positions. Those are some of the methods you can use. Or, of course, just doing research is also really helpful, absolutely, and then you can create a requirements profile that also includes things that are personally important to you, of course, that's fine too. So it always sounds super complicated, but one of the goals of this course is to show that it's actually not that hard. I mean, this course in total, if you were to do it all in one go, would take about 5 or 6 hours.
Of course, you can break it up for yourself,
Exactly, But just to show you, even though there's a lot of content, so to speak, it's all stuff that's actually logical and very intuitive. Really, once you take a look at it. Like, of course, why didn't I do it that way before? Or I don't know, it's just really straightforward too.
You even included examples and even quizzes and so on. Well, these days, you really need a bit of gamification when it comes to learning. And honestly, I made a few videos too, but you did most of them, you discussed and created them. But I can honestly say it's really entertaining as well. And if you pace yourself nicely, even the feedback we've received is that people really say, hey, I'm getting real value out of this.
Exactly, So it's not a huge investment, but what you get out of it, I think, is just the basics. And if you haven't learned those before, it's really a great opportunity, independent and flexible, too. You can join in at any time for the
course.
Everything is online, you have all the materials there, you have the quizzes, and of course, if needed, you also have support from the academy. So,
I think we've just done a little tour de horizon. We walked around a bit and hopefully whetted your appetite a little, too. I mean, if we sum it up, we're simply closing the gap that's there. People have to make personnel decisions and often have absolutely no idea about it. And here, I think, we provide very competent options, but also in a way that's easy to access to help close this gap. And yeah, where can you find out more about it? Of course, we have a learning page for it. You'll find it in the show notes. Costs, sorry, I'd say they're very reasonable. Yeah, the course costs, I think, €490 if I'm correctly informed. It's available permanently, so it's not like it'll disappear at some point. You get a certificate, and you can always dive back in whenever you want. So, it's really more of a companion, right? Would you say that's accurate?
Once you've finished the course, it doesn't just disappear. You'll still have access to the materials and can also download them.
Yeah, great. I think, Hanna, we've done a tour here that was hopefully interesting. I found the conversation with you really inspiring, and it reminded me again of the need, hey, something needs to be done, and we've done something about it. And that's why we're always happy about anyone who takes a closer interest. Please feel free to ask questions, and don't hesitate to contact us. And I think it's also available on our page in the shop. If you want direct access, you can simply invest in this course. Hanna, thank you so much for being here. It's great that we were able to create this product thanks to you.
Yeah, I'm happy about it too. It was also a lot of fun to create. I really hope it will help others and be useful.
Awesome. So thanks. See you soon. Bye. Bye.
Bye.